Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com. Wanted to update on the Julian Assange case as there was a hearing this morning. And also, every week at the end of the week, we're checking in with you, members, readers, donors, people we care about, to let you know how the week has gone. But we definitely have some important news here to deal with in the story, this top story that I've been following throughout 2020 and 2019, the extradition case against Julian Assange. And so this morning, for me, I woke up at about 3:50 a.m. and logged on to a conference call, which I believed was going to allow me to cover and report on what happened with the case management hearing, a very routine hearing in Julian Assange's case. And in particular, I was tuning in because back in June, there was a superseding indictment that was issued by the U.S. Justice Department that did not expand the charges, but expanded the scope of the case being brought against Julian Assange, added additional negative narrative detail to it. And all of the charges involve Chelsea Manning and the disclosures that were provided to WikiLeaks. And that's what those charges are that form the focus of the extradition case. But yet they expanded this timeline to include 4 additional years up through 2015. And they made it about hacking. They're trying to do more to make it seem that Julian Assange was not engaged in journalism in order to bolster the case. And they did this knowing pretty well what the defense was going to be bringing forward in the upcoming September hearing. And this has thrown everything into total disarray, and the confusion was amplified in the morning hours in the UK when the prosecution did not show up at the right time. The defense was ready to go at 10 a.m. in the UK. The prosecution was not present. And meanwhile, the press and any observers that were seeking access to follow the proceedings remotely, especially during this pandemic in which we're all social distancing and there's a limit to who can be in courthouses, we were not able to get any details, hear anything in the courtroom. And so we just see from people who managed to get into this Old Bailey courthouse in London that there is this confusion, that the prosecution did not show up. Now was the time that the prosecution was supposed to make sure the UK court had the superseding indictment, and that raised some more issues, which I'll get to in a moment. But an hour went by, and eventually they started the proceedings, but they did so without myself and a lot of other journalists who wanted to be able to report on what was happening. And the court didn't even bother, the judge, Vanessa Barretto, she didn't even bother to check to see if there were any press on this conference call line that needed to be able to hear these proceedings so that they could follow along. The proceedings just started. During that hour also, before the defense took advantage of this prosecution not showing up to have a video call with Assange. And they've had very little opportunity to do any conferring, talk with Julian about this case. For over the past 5 months, it's been extremely limited as to what he is able to do in preparation for a major hearing that is upcoming in September. So they start the proceedings, and we give up as journalists who are on this conference call because it becomes clear that we were in the wrong courtroom. We were hearing the wrong court proceedings. We've been patched in from the wrong case, and they're moving along, and they're talking about very crucial details, such as the fact that that the defense is going to challenge the superseding indictment and seek to exclude the new material that was added because it was improperly brought forward. They had a deadline a long time ago for adding any additional charging information or any of these details. And so now the government should have to pursue the case that they brought, and they shouldn't be allowed to change it. They shouldn't be allowed to expand the scope in the manner in which they did. And then there's the other issue of the fact that this is an abuse of process. And the abuse of process is that Julian Assange is currently in Belmarsh prison under the second superseding indictment, the superseding indictment, which is the second indictment. This is the one that expanded the charges from a simple conspiracy to commit computer crime charge, the one that made him out to be a hacker. They started with that before they brought the charges under the Espionage Act. And of course, that's the one that has received so much attention. The Espionage Act charges got the attention of all of these press freedom groups. So you have that indictment, and it no longer exists anymore. It's null and void because the U.S. Justice Department issued a superseding indictment in June. And so technically, one could argue that the entire clock and all of the processes and everything that's involved in extradition restarts. And that's how all should move forward. Where there was a February hearing back in 2020 that I attended, in which legal arguments were made about the extradition case that was being put forward by the U.S. government. Do we need to have that all over again because they've expanded the scope of the superseding indictment? Those were the questions that were asked by the defense. And this is such an abuse of process because Julian Assange is technically, and I mean very technically, in a prison right now, but is not properly under arrest. And to some degree, these are formalities. Practically speaking, this looks like laziness on the part of the U.S. government, not really wanting to go through the whole process of bringing him to a court and rearresting him and doing this, wanting to put it off. It appears that they're going to do this the first day of that September hearing. But still, this is a part of due process. This is part of you getting your rights read to you and understanding the charges that are being brought forward against you in a court. And he has a right to be treated fairly. And so far, this fact that he remains in the Belmarsh prison and yet they have not rearrested him is very unusual in the sense of the case. And it does seem like it could be a tactic. It feels like a tactic to throw off the entire defense's case or his legal team's case and to throw a wrench in the hearing that was planned in September. This hearing, let me outline for you, that is upcoming, will have witnesses from different aspects of the WikiLeaks story, I suppose is the way I would put it. There are going to be journalists that would be called to share evidence that can prove that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks they weren't reckless when they published information. And there's going to be people who are called forward that are doctors who can speak to the medical health of Julian Assange. And that was another thing in the case management hearing that journalists missed because they were not brought into the call. That there are that there's more deterioration of Assange's health happening over the last weeks, that this continues to unfold as he sits in a cell while this process, this extradition, has largely been static for the last 6 months. And he was denied bail. He requested to be put on home confinement during COVID-19, and yet Vanessa Barretzer denied that request. And this abusive process is something that could be rectified by Vanessa Barretzer. But through our friends over at the Declassified UK blog, we know that through their work, she is someone who's a rubber stamp on these extradition cases. About 96% of these cases, extradition is approved. And so we know that the reason why she isn't doing anything to remedy what is going on with Julian Assange and the improprieties in this case is because she's covering for the US government to ensure that this extradition gets to its endpoint as quickly as possible, or if not quick, that it at least gets to that endpoint, because certainly things are not moving quickly any longer. And well, that's a good point. We have a comment here saying that Barretzer might be nervous about being overturned on appeal related to political offenses, violation of attorney-client privilege. Yes, so certainly everything that's happening right now is being taken down by the legal team for Assange in order to bolster their case on appeal. And it doesn't look good for Vanessa, especially going back to that 1 week hearing when she wouldn't allow him out of the glass box and let him be part of the proceedings. I mean, said that he can't follow along. He doesn't really know what's happening in that courtroom. He can't hear very well. And the prosecution was okay with letting him sit with his attorneys. And she said, no, we are going to keep you in the glass box. Another example of the trampling of human rights that has gone on in this case. So now we've got this clear example of an abusive process. Why is he in prison right now? Well, because of the second indictment. But he can't be imprisoned under the second indictment because the second indictment doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by this second superseding indictment, or the third indictment, to speak simply. Well, then he should be arrested under the third indictment, but he's not. He is in Belmarsh prison and should probably be released. But the US government and the UK authorities don't want him to be released because maybe he would try to leave. Okay, well, they could just have police outside of the prison and they would rearrest him immediately after he was released. That would look bizarre. That would make the case look as bizarre as it has become. It would make it even harder to defend what is unfolding. Well, I suppose that's the liability that you take on when you're bringing this kind of a case that is putting a journalist on trial. So you should have to face up to that negative press. And so far, practically speaking, in order to make up for the fact that they have defects in their case, that perhaps they were concerned that the defense would be more prepared than they thought to rebut what they're trying to do here, they are covering for it. And the abusive process, the abuse of due process is happening in this case against Julian Assange. And for me, what that means at the end of these proceedings, we hear that they could come to the judge next week and request an adjournment of this hearing that is scheduled, this 3-week hearing. But, that's up to them. And perhaps Julian Assange doesn't want to wait anymore. This hearing is absolutely critical to his case. It's like the only time that they're going to be able to put information on the record that's evidence, and then that'll be considered in the extradition. And when it moves to appeal, it's going to center on anything that's in the court record. There won't be any new evidence that's brought. They won't take any new witness testimony, as I understand it. Will be all about whether Vanessa Barretzer followed the right judicial processes and procedures with the case, and if there were any violations of, like the commenter mentioned, political offenses, the political offenses of provision, or if there was violations of attorney-client privilege, other things that might have to do with the access to attorneys, etc. So who knows what is going to unfold here, but I'm left in this predicament where it's really tough to plan ahead in order to cover this case. It's unfortunate. There will be a need for journalists to come together and pressure this court to ensure that there is access come September. If in fact there is no delay and we are going to see this hearing take place in September, we need to be certain that the court is going to have a clerk that will be able to patch us in on these conference calls, make sure we're there so we can hear these proceedings. But you're seeing from observers like Rebecca Vincent from the Reporters Without Borders organization that this is as bad as it has ever been. That is atrocious the way that the magistrate court is managing this extradition case, which translates to it's probably going marvelously for the U.S. government, because none of what I'm describing would benefit the U.S. government in any way. The more transparency, the more understanding that the world had of what is happening here with this judge and this court and in this case would mean that it would be harder and harder to defend. And I'm maybe a little too charitable, but it being an election year, I'm not sure that any voter, be they Democrat or Republican, would totally support what the U.S. Justice Department is doing here in this unprecedented case, and that they would have questions equally for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and that they would also have questions for Trump and Mike Pence about what they are doing to allow this to move forward with their Justice Department. And so we need this pressure. We need this. We can't just rely on UK journalists that are in the UK. And yet one issue we have is that this coronavirus in the background does put a limitation on how many people can be in that courthouse. It disrupts the ability to travel there, because I would have to quarantine for up to 2 weeks, it seems, if I want to be in London to cover these proceedings. So the best thing, especially when you look at the graphs for how the pandemic is unfolding in these two different countries, it's terrifying in the US with about 60,000 cases a day. It's much, much lower in the smaller country of the UK. Seems to be in much more control. Not saying that I couldn't get COVID-19 if I was in the UK, but that I would be much safer in that country. But yeah, I'm coming from a country where I could be a spreader. And I think that the courthouse has to take that into consideration. And any American journalist probably should be making plans to cover it remotely. But I don't know how that is to be possible with the way that the court is managing their technology. There needs to be an organized effort to get a live stream of this 3-week proceeding. I'm hoping that pressure can be ramped up to ensure that there is some kind of guarantee that it isn't going to only be UK press that have any idea what is happening in this 3-week hearing. This is an American case. This is a case that will be ultimately tried if Julian Assange is brought to the United States in a U.S. courtroom. It will be precedent setting. It will be a case that is unlike anything in U.S. history under the Espionage Act. It will expand what the U.S. government is able to do in order to control the publication of information. And it will mean an erosion of First Amendment rights if the U.S. Justice Department is successful. And outlining those stakes, there needs to be something done so that we can all follow along in September if the hearing is going to take place. But eventually, it's going to have to happen. It's going to have to happen in November if it doesn't happen in September, or it'll have to happen early next year. And we still won't have a vaccine, and we'll probably still be in a place where we need to come up with some kind of ways for journalists to be able to cover this without traveling. They're going to limit the number of people that can be in the courthouse, extremely limit the number of journalists, and extremely limit the number of people in the public who can attend. There needs to be transparency for these proceedings, and it's too much to ask the Assange legal team to take up this issue. They have their own set of issues to deal with, and so I think it's on some of these press freedom organizations and it's on other journalists to start raising a fuss about all of this so that we know what happens in these crucial 3 weeks of hearings. The defense can make statements. His legal team can make statements to the public after these proceedings, but we want to follow along. We want to hear these witnesses that are brought forward. We want to know how the prosecutors are cross-examining and trying to rebut the testimony that witnesses are bringing forward. And right now, it seems like a very, very limited number of people are going to be exposed to what happens in that courtroom in September. And we have to do something to change that. We absolutely have to make sure that that's not the case come September. This is potentially what happened with Chelsea Manning's case when I covered it was huge and had a lot of implications. But I think when you get down to it, you could argue that this is even more of an important case, just because there's a lot of case law already that existed in order to pursue Chelsea Manning for releasing those materials. They are creating new precedents through this case against Julian Assange, which they know. They recognize that 7 or so years ago when Barack Obama was still president in the White House. So that's what I have to say right now. There's just a couple things I want to point to that are entirely unrelated to the topic of Assange. So if you drop off, I understand, but part of doing this, it's not always this long. We have something to talk about this week, or that just happened today, that I wanted to attend to. But on our pages, I would usually just point you to some of our material from the last week, so you could go to the website and see some of the fine work that we're supporting with donations from readers and with funding from our members. And we published a story from Michael Sanato, a great labor journalist whose work is featured in The Guardian, and he also does work for us on occasion. And he gave us this fantastic piece that we published called "The Raging Class War Against Poor and Working Class Americans During the COVID-19 Pandemic." And this documents what has been happening these last 5 to 6 months, the toll that it has taken on working Americans who are being asked to bear the brunt of a lot of this pandemic, while rich people make exorbitant and huge profits off of the pandemic. So I encourage you to go to our website and find that. It was published a few days ago. My colleague Brian has a new Beyond Prisons podcast episode that you could enjoy with Dr. Venezia Michelson. And that's the podcast that continues to engage in these conversations about moving away from prisons. It promotes decarceration and abolition, and also discusses things like defunding the police, which became hugely popular after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, and there were the Black Lives Matter uprisings in the last few months. So I encourage you to go there. In the past week, we looked at some of the legislation that's been brought forward and introduced into Congress that would give federal whistleblowers greater protections. And we'll continue to track those. And I cover that on my weekly show, The Dissenter Weekly. There's, again, the newsletter, the Dissenter newsletter. If you would like to make sure you get updates on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, as well as whistleblower stories that I'm covering, you can sign up there at dissenter.substack.com. So, this is crucial for us. We have to do something to make sure that everyone in the world is able to know what is happening with Julian Assange come this hearing. And so if it isn't going to be adjourned, if it's not going to be moved to a later date, there's a lot that the legal team is going to be taking on. first in dealing with the abusive process that has unfolded. They'll have to take care of that in the first days of the September hearing, and then they'll have to fit in and collect testimony from all the different witnesses. Some that I imagine aren't going to be able to appear there in person. And so it'll be important for us to all follow what they're fighting through in order to bring some kind of, ensure there's some kind of fairness and objectivity in the way that Julian Assange's extradition is reviewed. It's quite an uphill battle. Sisyphean. It doesn't really seem like it's going to be something that can be accomplished. But on the other hand, it has to be done. You have to fight the good fight, and you have to expose all along the way that processes and laws are not being followed. And then it falls on journalists like myself and others to take notice when there are abuses that are being that are happening. So I talked a long time. I've rambled. But I want to thank you for supporting our work over at Shadowproof. And we'll be back next week with another update on how things are going with our media organization. Until next time, you all have a good weekend.